Hello, I'm Marc Vatter, Senior Consultant in Energy Planning and Trading with Hitachi Energy USA and Adjunct Professor of Business and Security Studies at Riviera University. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article in International Advances in Economic Research entitled OPEC's Risk Premia and Volatility in Oil Prices. It's topical today, March 19th, 2022, because the U.S. has been experiencing accelerating inflation, and the article has implications for monetary policy, specifically regarding interaction between OPEC and the Fed. I have subtitled this presentation, "Nice World Economy You Have There, Be a Shame If Something Should Happen to It." You'll see why. For context, the main reason for the current inflation is the unprecedentedly massive monetization of the recent lockdown, not oil prices. The figure shows this. The quantitative easing by the Bernanke Fed in 2009 is also visible, but small by comparison. 40 years ago, the Volcker Fed faced 13% inflation that had been accelerating for 2 decades. The Powell Fed now faces 8% inflation that has been accelerating for 2 years. So in Volcker's time, inflationary expectations were deeply entrenched in people's transactions. For example, most union contracts contained automatic cost of living adjustments or COLAs. Today, inflationary expectations are present, as evidenced by rising nominal rates on corporate bonds, but not entrenched as evidenced by falling real wages over the winter. So I have called the graph inverted U-shaped demand curve for Fed assets when inflationary expectations are soft. If the Fed sells large quantities of securities up front, it can lower these soft inflationary expectations by proving that it is serious about killing off the inflation, thus lowering the nominal rate of interest that investors require to hold them, implying an increase in the price of the assets. Once this unique opportunity is tapped out, the Fed reaches what I call critical credibility, and the relationships among asset sales, asset prices, and nominal rates of interest assume their familiar qualitative forms. Whatever I say about OPEC and the Fed below, let me be clear that I think the Fed should move swiftly and boldly to reduce its balance sheet, insofar as the current inflation results from the massive monetary overhang, which it mainly does. Rising oil prices have also contributed to the current inflation, as in the 1970s and early 1980s. The rapid increase in the price of crude oil since April of 2020 has been larger than that in the fall of 1973 and has been accommodated by the Fed to date. The Fed has chosen high inflation over low unemployment as the economic consequence of the increase in the price of fuel, as it did after the stagflation of 1974 and 75, when the CPI rose 10% and 9% respectively. From 1976 through 1978, under the Burns Fed, real oil prices did not fall, but were comparatively stable. Inflation abated to 6%, and there was no recession. The oil shock prompted by the 1979 revolution in Iran took inflation to 11%, 13%, and 10% in 1979, 80, and 81, respectively. The main cause of the inflation the Volcker Fed faced was the 2 unprecedented increases in the price of crude oil. At that time, inflation had been trending up since the early 1960s, so inflationary expectations had become deeply entrenched in people's transactions, and the Volcker Fed had to prove that they were willing to inflict extreme pain on American industry in order to end the inflation. They did. The Volcker Fed created the Rust Belt, but stuck to its guns long enough to kill off the inflation, about 3 years. Had the Volcker Fed waited until 1986, when the price of oil collapsed, to finish killing off the inflation, as the Burns Fed was on track to do, it might have done so without nearly as much pain and dislocation in industrial America. But Volcker may not have anticipated the collapse in oil prices. After 50 years of the OPEC era of volatile oil pricing, it is easier to assume the price will come back down. And I have explained some of the reasons for the instability of the OPEC era in 2 articles. The second, from International Advances in Economic Research, is an application of standard financial theory to OPEC's pricing of crude oil. In the Consumption Capital Asset Pricing Model, or CCAPM, an asset can be used to offset systematic risk, the risk to aggregate consumption, if its high returns occur when consumption is low and its low returns occur when consumption is high. OPEC's revenues do this when it makes the price of crude oil volatile. So this can explain one reason among more than one for the volatility of the price of crude oil during the OPEC era. In the long run, OPEC will price where net demand to OPEC is elastic, like a monopolist. But the short-run demand for crude oil at that price is very inelastic, so OPEC can raise revenues considerably with price shocks in the short run. The extent to which it does this depends positively on its rate of time preference, negatively on its excess capacity, since that makes it easier to avoid Bertrand competition within the cartel. That is, little excess capacity makes it easier to avoid Bertrand competition, and positively on any disruption to OPEC plus supply, as in Iran in 1979, Libya in 2011, and Russia in 2022. Since net demand to the remaining members of the cartel increases temporarily, OPEC's decisions about price reflect OPEC's decisions about price affect the macroeconomy. When OPEC raises the price of crude oil for the short run, its revenues rise while aggregate production and consumption fall. According to the CCAP-M, a securitized OPEC revenue stream would command a risk premium in financial markets, but only if OPEC destabilizes price. This gives OPEC incentive to destabilize the price of crude oil. The Fed, therefore, can expect the price of crude oil to fall at some point. Low prices are also part of the volatility that OPEC finds profitable. Recall that the trough in oil prices in early 2020, even before the lockdown, was a deliberate effort by OPEC to drive marginal U.S. shale producers out of business, and it succeeded. Though I advocate large sales of Fed assets early, the implication here is that the Fed should wait until the price of oil falls to complete the process of killing off the inflation, when that fall in the price of oil provides an offsetting, stabilizing boost to the macroeconomy. Another implication is that if the Fed precipitates a recession while the price of crude oil is still high, it will reward OPEC with countercyclical revenues and incent it to further destabilize the price of oil and therefore the macroeconomy in the future. Increases in oil prices slow the macroeconomy more than equivalent decreases speed it up. So volatility in oil prices is antithetical to the Fed's goal of maximizing employment. Anton Marc attributed the asymmetry to downwardly sticky wages. Much of the world uses petroleum products to travel to work, so oil is a complement to labor in the production of a large part of all goods. When oil prices rise, employment rather than wages falls. But wages rather than employment may rise when oil prices fall. Therefore, if the Fed incents OPEC to destabilize oil prices through its monetary policy, it will not maximize employment. Regarding the research and international advances in economic research, on the face of it, it might not seem that OPEC can command a risk premium for volatility because its revenues correlate positively with aggregate consumption. Using monthly data from January 1974 through June 2017, the correlation between OPEC's revenues and U.S. personal consumption expenditures is 0.71, which is highly statistically significantly positive. But similar to Lutz Kilian, I distinguished between volatility in OPEC's revenues originating in oil prices from volatility originating in the macroeconomy. I found that when volatility originated with the price of oil, OPEC's revenues were negatively related to aggregate consumption. So OPEC can, in fact, earn a risk premium in financial markets by promulgating volatility in oil prices. OPEC can use its revenues to insure others against the macroeconomic volatility it causes by making the price of crude oil volatile. Nice world economy you have there. Be a shame if something should happen to it. On methods, I regressed the log of U.S. aggregate personal consumption to that of OPEC's revenues, a lagged dependent variable, and monthly indicators, instrumenting for revenues using the first leg of price. With price, thus, entering exogenously as when OPEC raises price, I found that the elasticity of OPEC's revenues was negative 774 with respect to U.S. aggregate consumption and negative 578 with respect to European consumption. Very elastic and therefore very countercyclic. Rearranging the equation and letting aggregate consumption enter exogenously, I found that OPEC's revenues were positively related, but very inelastic with respect to aggregate consumption. In the CCAP-M, assets with fixed returns can also be used to hedge systematic risk, so OPEC can use its revenues to hedge exogenous macroeconomic volatility. OPEC blames the current price shock on Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine and Joe Biden for discouraging U.S. shale production on climate grounds. But OPEC is pretty blatantly leveraging these scarcities to drive up the price of crude oil by restraining its own production. I will read some quotes verbatim from Morris Adelman. In 1978 to 80, the oil price tripled for the usual reason. Not that wells were giving out, but because OPEC nations, particularly Saudi Arabia, shut in production rather than let it rise to rather than let it expand to make up for Iranian fluctuations. From Reuters, when Libyan production ceased during the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, Saudi Arabia's oil minister said on Sunday, the kingdom had slashed output by 800,000 barrels per day in March due to oversupply, sending the strongest signal yet that OPEC will not act to quell soaring prices. Consumers have urged the exporters group to pump more crude to put a cap on oil, which surged to more than $127 a barrel this month, its highest level in 2.5 years, amid unrest in North Africa and the Middle East. Oil ministers from Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates echoed Saudi Arabia's Ali al-Naim's concerns about oversupply and said rocketing crude prices were out of the hands of OPEC, which next meets in June. Irina Slav quoted the energy minister from the UAE in oilprice.com a few weeks ago, who said, I don't believe that the market is hugely undersupplied currently. It's the other factors that are outside our hands which are impacting the market, Emirati Suhail al-Mazrui said. According to Rystad Energy, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Kuwait together have about 4 million barrels per day of spare capacity that can be brought onto the market within a 3 to 6 month period, and most of these countries have vast onshore storage capabilities that can be tapped, meaning that a few million barrels could be nominated for exports in weeks, if not days, said Louise Dixon of Rystad. OPEC could bring down the price of crude oil quickly, but it may wait to do so. Either way, the assertion, both in 2011 and 2022, that it could not is a bald-faced lie. Though, as a quasi-monopolist, OPEC can be expected to price where long-run demand is elastic, it can create a counter-cyclic stream of revenue for itself by initiating price shocks in the short run, followed by declines in price that help rebuild net demand to OPEC. Therefore, the Fed can expect the price of oil to fall from its current high levels, as future markets now indicate they will. Again, the main reason for the current inflation is the large monetary overhang from the lockdown, and I've argued for large early reductions in the Fed's balance sheet, but rising oil prices have also contributed to the inflation. By waiting for them to come down, the Fed can balance out that stimulus with a contemporaneous monetary contraction that gets inflation back to 2% per annum. This will also help the Fed avoid rewarding OPEC with countercyclic profits by perhaps precipitating a recession when oil prices are high, which would incent OPEC to further destabilize oil prices in the future. If OPEC does bring oil prices down quickly, perhaps because the war in Ukraine ends or a nuclear agreement with Iran is negotiated, that will give the Fed still more reason to act swiftly and boldly to kill the U.S. inflation. Finally, if increases in the rate of interest increase OPEC's rate of time preference, incenting it to choose price shocks at the expense of future demand destruction. If the Fed if the Fed raises interest rates too much, it could not only precipitate a recession, but exacerbate the current oil shock. Here are my acknowledgments and references. I thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the coming of spring.